welcome to, I guess this is the second event for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame weekend. Today's program consists of two parts. The first part comprises readings by three undergraduates who wrote poems inspired by A.E. Stallings, and then it'll be followed up with a reading, I guess it's three-part, and a conversation with A.E. Stallings afterwards. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame for co-hosting the reading. I'm Gerald, I'm the editor of the Georgia Review. We'd also like to thank Still Point Literary Magazine for producing the zine Encomium, Poems After A.E. Stallings. And a special thanks to Sherry Liu for serving as editor-in-chief. Those pamphlets, those chapbooks are outside. I'm at the Georgia Review table, be sure to pick one up. UJ Bookstore for selling books. There's a room down there, and if you walk in, it's mountains and mountains and mountains of books that you can buy. LRG Provisions for catering, and all the library staff that helped make the event possible. So to start, I'm gonna introduce all the Still Point readers in the order in which they will appear. Okay. We'll start with Sherry Liu, senior editor of Still Point Literary Magazine and editor-in-chief of Encomium, Poems After A.E. Stallings. She'll read her poem, Round Here. Sherry is a senior majoring in genetics and English. Clarissa Bond, a second year majoring in biology and classics, will read Orpheus's prologue. And Jessica Hamlin, a fourth year majoring in journalism and English, will read Plastic Eucalyptus.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be able to read at this event tonight. So my poem is titled Round Here. In perpetual dust and curls, skeeters are a thing round here, but they won't bother you if you dress in the colors of the sun or the patterns of grandma's curtains and are a ma'am or Mrs., or better yet, a miss, because they will mistake your pale smoothness for porcelain from which orchid women with chiffon breaths sip lavender tea and partake of ambrosia underneath the porch roof in white wicker furniture behind white columns, under the impression they are Greek goddesses of poise, hospitality, and husband hunting. Careful now, those deviled eggs might be dusted with rust, not paprika. The cure to every ailment around here: listen to your mama, go to church, find yourself a nice man who can listen and sweat, and have a daughter who can type and smile real wide. Thank you.
Hi, I'm also really honored to read at this event. I think it's really cool to be able to do this. A fun fact about this poem, I actually wrote it back in April, before I even knew we were going to be doing poems inspired by A.E. Stallings, because that's when I first started reading her work, and I was inspired by her work inherently, and I wrote this poem. So I think this actually really matches really well with what had already happened, because Sherry emailed me and said, oh, so we're all going to do something about A.E. Stallings, and I was like, oh, interesting, wow. So this is Orpheus's prologue, and it's inspired by Eurydice's footnote by A.E. Stallings. Be careful when you speak the name of Orpheus, for though I hear he's everywhere, in bars, on Broadway, and in beats of poetry, both yours and mine, he's still owed some respect. He still owed some contempt. Are you not furious that he just had to trust Eurydice but couldn't, didn't have the faith? And what's a faithless love? What's love unless someone could walk for lifetimes through infinity and never turn to see, knowing their heart is close behind? What is a poet who can sing to kings and queens and shades below, to readers years and years away, and to his love when they're alone, but can't stay silent and be sure of anything he's done? Drunk on shadows, singing show tunes we write down as glorious, the legacy, the tragedy of Thracian Orpheus. Where is beauty? Where is love in this great myth about a man who strutted before Hades and turned on his loving wife? But then I'll think how lonely and how mournful he must be, so far for now from what he loves, just like Persephone. How many nights has he lain weeping under trees who loved his song? Can lyre strings or wedding rings give him joy anymore? It's what he gets, what he deserves for facing gods and fate. Yet facing them knowing you'll fail, that's where the beauty lies. For what shines brighter than a light against unyielding, boundless night? Thank you.
Hi, it's an honor to be here. I'll be reading my poem, Plastic Eucalyptus. Guilt fits underneath every one moment of calm. A lull in the squeaking contains perforated promises of scotch-taped brokenness. Concentrated clouds of warm, oiled air can't remove the layers of dirt and dust and skin who lay under there. To water a velvet fern is not to establish roots. To carve a half circle into a copper urn, to color it yellow with purple hues, is not to feel the sun. Your green thumb alchemical delusion. Thank you.
Proper introduction. So welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce writer, translator, and UGA alumna A.E. Stallings, and to do so on the weekend of her induction into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, no less. When writers, critics, and award committees extol her work, they invariably mention Stallings' debt to and connection with the literature of ancient Greece. This is warranted, of course. She's a deft translator of ancient Greek texts and a moving poet whose touchstone is the body of work at the beginning of Western literary history, as we've come to know it. Literary critic Yopi Prinz has proven that a prominent, if not the main lineage of English feminist writing, grew out of female engagements with ancient Greek literature, most notably that of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Virginia Woolf, and Hilda Doolittle. This lineage is prominent once again now in North American poetry, with Anne Carson, Gertrude Schnackenberg, and A.E. Stallings at the forefront. And these brilliant poems written by these talented undergraduates just prove, how powerful, Stallings' feminist sensibility can, ramify forward and inspire others to kind of put words to these thoughts and situations and emotions. So yes, when one reads or hears Stallings' poetry, the primary debt to Athens, the one of the Mediterranean world, is unmistakably there. But one shouldn't mistake that that southern gal is not. Take, for instance, a poem called Cast Irony, which starts, quote, "Who scrubbed this iron skillet in water with surfactant soap?" End quote. We all know what happens, rust. And we all know how to remedy it, but it takes someone with the poetic gift of Stallings to tell us how in a way that occasions further thought. Only a reseasoning can give the vessel's life new lease. Scour off the scab the color of dried blood, apply some elbow grease to make it fast. Anoint it, put it once more in the fire where everything is cast. It's the particular power of literature to make an everyday object like this cast iron skillet a vessel for thought more encompassing of human life. The process of reseasoning that Stallings describes resonates strongly with what 19th century poet and translator Percy Shelley says about translation. Quote, "The language of poets has ever affected a certain uniform and harmonious recurrence of sound, which is scarcely less indispensable to the communication of its influence than the words themselves. Hence, the vanity of translation. It were as wise to cast a violet into a crucible that you might discover the formal principle of its color and odor, as seek to transfuse from one language into another the creations of a poet. The plant must spring again from its seed, or it will bear no flower. And this is the burden of the curse of Babel, end quote. In other words, accuracy in grammar, syntax, and diction does not suffice for a living translation. As Stallings says of the skillet, scour off the scab and put it once more in the fire where everything is cast. Thus, Stallings' translations are rightly praised because we see in them Lucretius and Hesiod flourish again. We can also see this poetic translation working in the poems themselves. Stallings time and again recasts tales from the ancient Greek to not only make sense of a present moment through past examples, but, moreover, to have the beauty and truth of the ancient Greek spring again from its seed within the grounds of the 21st century world. Whether it's understanding one's first love through Persephone, meditating on misogynist double standards for female speech through Cassandra, reckoning with her son's resentment through his namesake Jason, or reckoning with her daughter's resentment through her namesake, Atalanta. Stallings invokes the past in a way that shows us that we can always learn something from the past because something in the past always lives in the present moment. I can't leave without noting that, at least as it appears in the poems, a place very much like this one, and likely one around these parts, was formative to Stallings' young mind in its doubtless precocious stage. The poem Ubi Sunt Lament for the Eccentric Museums of My Childhood starts, quote, orphan oddments crammed in university basements, in corridors of state capitals, identified by jaundiced index cards, I think about you now. Where have the curators of new collections stashed you? Another poem titled The Erstwhile Archivists shares that, quote, the summer that I turned 19 and felt grown up in love, I took a job as an archivist. The title for the latter is a bit disingenuous. She is still an archivist, has always been, at least since the summer she was 19. She's still an archivist at heart because her poems speak with the confidence that being grown up in love requires some cataloging of the past, imaginative or not, for some future person one would likely never meet. Stallings ends The Erstwhile Archivist by speaking of her encounter with old wedding photos. Quote, the brittle shades of love I lifted like x-rays to the light and filed the past away for some frown-lined researcher on some far winter day. Well, November's not that far from winter. Here we are. A. Stallings is an American poet and translator who studied classics at the University of Georgia and the University of Oxford. She has published 4 books of poetry and 2 books of translation. Her accolades include the Guggenheim Fellowship and a fellowship from the MacArthur Foundation. Please join me in welcoming A. Stallings.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here today and very moving. I was very moved by those fantastic poems and to think that I might have had some small part in inspiring them. That makes me very, very moved. So thank you very much to the editor, Sherry Liu. Obviously I want to thank the Board of Judges for this honor. I wouldn't have been at the University of Georgia if it weren't for the Foundation Fellows who enticed me here. And I think that the Classics Department was vital not only in my going into translation, but unfailingly. Classics professors of mine were very encouraging about my original poetry and never seemed to think it was a foolish thing to want to pursue or go into. And I was reminded by some former roommates here today that I had 2 of my classics professors at my first reading, which was downtown Athens at a place called the Downstairs, which is now called something else. very underworldy. I'm very moved to have people from almost all stages of my life here. I've got at least 4 or 5 former roommates and housemates who are here and here to whisper sic transit gloria mundi in my ear if I get too big for my britches, and former teachers and mentors. I realized, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, I realized we hadn't fully discussed how long the reading was to be as opposed to the conversation, so maybe you'll wave if I go too far in any direction. So I don't normally read a lot of early poems. I'm going to read some early poems, I think, because I'm here back at the beginning. I did fly in yesterday from Athens, so Athens to Athens. This is an early poem from my first book, My Archaic Smile, and I wrote it not too long after my undergraduate years here, so I think it still maybe resonates with the downstairs and various other things. One of my favorite characters, or myths, is the Hades and Persephone one. It turns out I write a lot about the underworld, and I continue to write about the underworld. The underworld is my place. And this, of course, you all remember the myth, and Hades snatches Persephone while she's picking flowers and takes her to be the queen of the underworld. And as a fairly young person, I thought, wouldn't it be really fun to write from the point of view of the creepy king of the underworld who snatches the girl? And I think it's very influenced by My Last Duchess. I realize now. Hades welcomes his bride. Come now, child, adjust your eyes, for sight is here a lesser sense. Here you must learn directions through your fingertips and feet and map them in your mind. I think some shapes will gradually appear. The pale things twisting overhead are mostly roots, although some worms arrive here clinging to their dead. Turn here. And in this hall will sit our thrones, and here you shall be queen, my dear, the queen of all men ever to be born. No smile. Well, some solemnity befits a queen. These thrones I have commissioned to be made are unlike any you imagined. They glow of deep black diamonds and lead, subtler and in better taste than gold, as will suit your timid beauty and pale throats. Come now. Down these winding stairs, the air more still and dry and easier to breathe. Here is a room for your diversions. Here I've set a loom and silk unraveled from the finest shrouds and dyed the richest, rarest shades of black. Such pictures you shall weave, such tapestries. For you I chose those 3 thin shadows there, and they shall be your friends and loyal maids. And do not fear from them such gossiping, as servants usually are wont. They have not mouth nor eyes, and cannot thus speak ill of you. Come, come, this is the greatest room. I had it specially made after great thought, so you would feel at home. I had the ceiling painted to recall some evening sky, but without the garish stars and lurid moon. What? That stark shape crouching in the corner, sweet, that is to be our bed. Our bed. Ah, your hand is trembling. I fear there is, as yet, too much pulse in it. It was fun to write. The man who wouldn't plant willow trees. Willows are messy trees. Hair in their eyes, they weep like women after too much wine and not enough love. They litter along with leaves like the butts of regrets smoked down to the filter. They are always out of kilter. Thirsty as drunks, they'll sink into a sewer with their roots. They have no pride. There's never enough sorrow. A breeze threatens, and they shake with sobs. Willows are slobs and must be cleaned up after. They'll bust up pipes just looking for a drink. Their fingers tremble, but make wicked switches. They claim they are sorry, but they whisper it. I haven't read this poem in a long time, but I think all of my former roommates and housemates and hallmates will recognize this person. For the losers of things. She is shedding belongings wherever she goes. Necklaces, combs, virginity, lovers, bus money, phone numbers, gifts and their givers, in the laundry perhaps, in the pockets of clothes, dropped in the aisle of the eastbound train, slipped down the seat of her carpool ride, or her 18th year in the Lenten tide, and places more difficult to explain, like deep in dreams, like halfway there, she has left by her unfinished drink at the bar, the keys to her house and the keys to her car. The ribbon that orders her unruly hair, he is calling her number, she is not in, she is shedding her dress like scales, like love, a dry silk hide she has cast off, she is ranging abroad in her new skin. And one of the things that's really fun about being a poet, I mean, I think originally I thought I would also maybe be a novelist, but that takes a lot more focus and attention. I think all poets have a certain kind of, a particular kind of, not exactly attention deficit, but a particular kind of attention that they have. So one of the great things about being a poet is you can write about the same thing over and over again. And this is, you know, a theme of your work. So this is the same story of Hades and Persephone, but it is in a very different form. I write almost exclusively in what we call received forms. We often think of that as being sonnets, but I use sometimes forms that are not even poetic forms. And this is one of these non-poetic forms, but you'll recognize it. And it's the same story, but maybe more from the Persephone point of view. First love, a quiz. He came up to me, A, in his souped up Camaro, B, to talk to my skinny best friend, C, and bumped my glass of wine so I wore the Ferris stain on my sleeve, D, from the ground in a lit chariot drawn by a team of stallions black as crude oil and breathing sulfur, at his heart he sported a tiny golden arrow. He offered me A, ride, B, dinner and a movie with a wink at the cliche, C, an excuse not to go back alone to the apartment with its sink of dirty knives, D, a narcissus with 100 dazzling petals that breathed a sweetness as cloying as decay. I went with him because A, even his friends told me to beware, B, I had nothing to lose except my virginity, C, he placed his hand in the small of my back and I felt the tread of honeybees, D, he was my uncle, the one who lived in the half-finished basement, and he took me by the hair. The place he took me to, A, was dark as my shut eyes, B, and where I ate bitter seed and became ripe, C, and from which my mother would never take me wholly back, though she wept and walked the earth and made the bearded ears of barley wither on their stalks and the blasted flowers drop from their sepals. D is called by some men hell and others love. E, all of the above. That was also fun to write. thinking partly of particular people when I read some poems, but I feel like if I start dedicating things that I'll mess up and leave someone out. This one is called Handbook of the Foley Artist. I don't know if people know what a Foley artist is. I didn't know before I wrote this poem, but I heard about it. So the Foley artist is the person who makes the sounds that go along with the movie. So just because someone is stomping down the hall doesn't mean that what you're hearing is someone stomping down the hall. It could be someone imitating that sound, so it sounds like you're on a spaceship or something. And this seemed to me like a wonderful metaphor for what the poet does, is to find the right sounds for the right things. So this is Handbook of the Foley Artist. For the sound of distant thunder, a father frowning. For the smack of sarcasm, pop of bubblegum. For a sudden summer downpour, sizzle of bacon. For the sound of somewhere else, freight train at 2 a.m. For the sound of snoring, bees in the lilac bush. For the sound of insomnia, eyelashes against a pillowcase. For the sea's din, blood's hush in the cochlea of the ear. For the skreek of a seagull, the playground's rusted swing. For the sound of birth, the radio between pangs. For death, static of flies. For dry bones, fig trees clattering in the wind. For the vowel of the wind, a dog left out in the yard. Crumple paper for the fricative of fire. For the gasp of an opened letter, strike a match. Take the telephone off the hook for the sound of no answer. For the sound of a broken heart, crack a joke. It's interesting to me that this book came out in 2012, and already the sound of a telephone off the hook is kind of an archaism. My son, when he was maybe 10, had to call a friend from the landline and kept coming back to me and saying something is wrong with the phone. And I said, no, there's nothing wrong with the phone. Something's wrong with the number, no. And I had to go watch him. And he was dialing the phone and then picking it up because he didn't know how the landline worked. This is how you get something like linear A or the end of writing. It takes one generation. Accident waiting to happen, or Finn. Like the scalding cup of coffee you left at the brink of the table, I brim with potential. I'm bright and unstable as a just mopped floor. I'm a curtain near a candle, finger in the door, a loose axe handle. I'm the wrist flicked fast with no backwards look, blindly casting the innocent fishhook. I'm the toy on the stair, the hole in the street. I'm right in plain sight. I'm under your feet. I'm over your head. I've got an edge and I hang by a thread. It's almost time and my aim is steady. You're falling for me. I feel it. I'm ready. I should read this one. I don't know how I'm doing it time-wise. Maybe I'll. So my daughter is named Atalanta, and when she was born, I phoned my mother in Atlanta, and I told her we'd had a girl and we were naming her Atalanta, and there was a pause. And she said, "But what will you call her?" For Atalanta. Your name is long and difficult. I know. So many people whom we didn't ask have told us so. and taken us to task. You too perhaps will wonder as you grow and blame us with the venom of 13 for ruining your life, using our own love against us, keen as a double-bladed knife. Already I can picture the whole scene. How will we answer you? Yes, you were in a hurry to arrive, as if it were a race to be alive. We weighed the syllables and they rang true. And we were hoping, too, you'd come to like the stories of princesses who weren't set on shelves like china figurines, not allegories, but girls whose glories included rescuing themselves, slaying their own monsters, running free, but not running away. It might be tough, singled out for singularity. Tough. Beauty will be of some help, you'll see. But it is not enough to be nimble, brave, or fleet, oh apple of my eye. The world will drop many gilded baubles at your feet to break your stride. Don't look down, don't stoop to scoop them up. Don't stop. One of my characters who reappears, not my characters, but is the Minotaur, the Minotaur. I feel for him, you know. Stuck in the dark. And I don't know, the sculptures of him, it's one thing to read the stories, but the sculptures of him and even the ancient images of him tend to be, he's either kind of weirdly handsome, or, you know, just very sweet. So this is Art Monster. My mother fell for beauty, although it was another species. Ox-eyed, dew-lapped, groomed for sacrifice. She had to devise another self to put herself in, something inhuman or beauty could not possess her. Oh, didal mechanics. She grew huge with hybridity. Rumor ripened. I was born to be amazed. She fascinated me with cat's cradles, spun threads out of my hirsute hair shirt. I was fed on raw youths and maidens when all I wanted was the cud of clover. I was named after my stepfather, dispenser of judgment. No one called me my mother's son. Minotaur, they said, oh, Minotaur, you are unnatural, grotesque. A hero will come to slay you, a hero who jilts princesses on desert islands. It is heroic to slay, to break a heart, to solve the archaic puzzle in the basement, demonster the darkness. I await this patiently as I bow to the yoke of making, scratching this earliest of inscriptions on a potsherd down here in the midden, writing left to right, then right to left, as a broken beast furrows a field. I've lived in the other Athens, it's strange to call it that, the other Athens since 1999. I was gonna move there for 2 years, and we had children and mortgages, and it's been a very interesting time to be in Greece, unfailingly interesting. It could be less interesting, but my husband's a journalist, it's good for journalists. So we arrived there was so much optimism about the euro, and we're gonna enter the Eurozone, and the Olympics, and 2008, of course, this all came crashing down. In 2014, 15, this wave of the refugee crisis started coming, and these kind of merged in Greece to be kind of quite a catastrophe. And I did start writing a little bit about the refugee situation, and I don't consider myself a political poet, but in some ways, this kind of intertwined with classics and poetry in a lot of interesting ways to me. I reread now the Iliad and the Odyssey, and certainly the plays very differently. They're often about issues of asylum seekers, refugees, and hospitality, exile, strangers, all of that. And it's that same stretch of water that people have been crossing forever. This is a poem, I think and Leandra mentioned this earlier today, and I wanted to read it. I don't know how I'm doing. So in 2016, January of 2016, there were a lot of drownings. There still are a lot of drownings in the Aegean. You probably they don't make the news here because people are coming in little dinghies, and it's the Aegean, the weather changes very quickly. And people are wearing all of their clothing, because they can only pack so much, and they get. One morning in January, I opened my Facebook and, I see 40 people have drowned off the island of Lesbos, and 23 of them are children, and I just packed my children off to school. And I started to have dreams about this, and so this is a poem kind of about that. It's called Empathy. My love, I'm grateful tonight. Our listing bed isn't a raft, precariously adrift, as we dodge the Coast Guard light and clasp hold of a girl and a boy. I'm glad we didn't wake our kids in the thin hours to take not a thing, not a favorite toy, and didn't hand over our cash to one of the smuggling rackets, that we didn't buy cheap life jackets, no better than bright orange trash and less buoyant. I'm glad that the dark above us is not deeply twinned beneath us and moiled with wind, and we don't scan the sky for a mark, any mark that demarcates a shore as the dinghy starts taking on water. I'm glad that our 6-year-old daughter, who can't swim, is a foot off the floor in the bottom bunk, and our son with his broken arms high and dry, that the ceiling is not seeping sky with our journey but hardly begun. Empathy isn't generous, it's selfish. It's not being nice to say I would pay any price not to be those who die to be us. Should I do a couple more? One more? One, two. All right. Classic students will appreciate this one. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. The mood made him tense. How she sharpened conditional futures on strops of might-have-beens, the butchered present in sutures. He cursed in the fricative, the way she could not act or live in the indicative, only contrary to fact. Tomorrow should have been vast, bud packed, grenade gravid, not just a die miscast. It made him sad, it made him livid, how she constructed from the imperfect past a future less vivid. I'll conclude with a Villanelle 19-line poem. Some lines will repeat. There will be 2 rhyme sounds. After a Greek proverb, Uden monimotoron tu prosorinu. We're here for the time being, I answer to the query. Just for a couple of years, we said, a dozen years back, nothing is more permanent than the temporary. We dined sitting on folding chairs. They were cheap but cheery. We've taped the broken window pane, TV still out of whack. We're here for the time being, I answer to the query. When we crossed the water, we only brought what we could carry, but there are always boxes that you never do unpack. Nothing is more permanent than the temporary. Sometimes when I'm feeling weepy, you propose a theory. Nostalgia and tear gas have the same acrid smack. We're here for the time being, I answer to the query. We stash bones in the closet when we don't have time to bury, stuff receipts in envelopes, file papers in a stack. Nothing is more permanent than the temporary. 12 years now, and we're still eating off the temporary, the ordinary. We left our wedding china behind, afraid that it might crack. We're here for the time being, we answer to the query, but nothing is more permanent than the temporary.
we have, can you hear me? So we have time for a Q&A. I want to start, I'm going to start with one. I'm not, it's not just us, but there was a moment when you mentioned that you wanted to be a novelist, but you found yourself to be a poet because there was some sort of attention, kind of particular type of attention that you gravitated towards this going back or this returning. The American poet and translator Richard Howard said prose precedes and verse reverses. Could you just describe a little bit about what happens when you return to, say, a story, for the second or third or fourth or fifth time? Is there any way to describe the particularities of that attention, kind of the pleasure that you have, what that does for you, that recurrence?
Well, is this on?
Hello? Oh, yes. Hello. Well, part of it is I do think that my imagination is very diachronic. I'm always looking at layers of things through time, but part of it is just getting older, so that when you write about Persephone and you're 20, it's one thing, and when you write about Demeter and Persephone when you are twice that old, it's something else. Even Boland writes about that. That's partly just that you enter the story at different points, and you come to, maybe there are other aspects. The great thing I think about poetry, although this is also true of fiction, is that you can return to something and kind of enter it in a different way and look at it turn it around, and that it's kind of infinite in that way. And your life experience changes. It's one thing to write about motherhood before you're a mother, and it's another thing, when you have children. And that's the great human thing about the Greek myths and fairy tales in general, actually, I would say, is that they do encapsulate so much of human experience, but they also leave a lot of gaps. There's plenty of room for you to go in, and I almost like Minecraft or a sort of sandbox video game, as you can tell, I'm a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old. But that idea of, that you can go into this world and walk around and change it, and that's part of the pleasure.
You're coming back to a place. And I think returning to a place and returning to a story, there's a weird, it's, for me, interesting to think about how returning to a place and returning to a story, returning to a piece of literature are similar and are not, when you come back to Athens so many years later, the place has changed and you're coming at it from a different way, but there's something maybe about you said the spaces within a story, when you re-inhabit a space of a story, it's different than when you're coming back to a place in the world, right?
Yes, although one of the things, I don't know that I've been back in Athens in November, ever. And that was can people hear me? I don't know. That is the smells and the ginkgo leaves, and you cross paths with the ghost of your former self, and that always gives you a bit of a chill. You walk past something, and it's as if you can see back through time and see that person walking with her books, or talking in a certain place, and there's a kind of eeriness of seeing the ghost of your past selves and walking through them, and that sounds kind of metaphysical, but I think there is the feeling of occasionally turning a corner and walking through the ghost of my 20-year-old self.
That great line that Ralph Ellison wrote about how writers get to choose their own ancestors. Have you heard that? You know what I'm talking about? Who did you do that, and who are they? What ancestors did you choose?
Well, I guess I don't know if everyone heard the question whether about writers choosing their own ancestors and who those ancestors would be. To a certain extent, writers cannot really be trusted on this. I think Harold Bloom has a whole book about that. But people I'm aware of, include A.E. Housman, with whom I share some initials, and Sylvia Plath, Elizabeth Bishop, Hardy, Larkin are among these. Although, to be honest, in some ways, I'm often more affected by individual poems. Every poet has their own personal anthology, so there might be poets not in that list, but there maybe have an individual poem in that anthology that is hugely important for me. And it changes, and I think one can't really be trusted because the subconscious might have a whole other list of answers.
Mike, if you have a question.
I've enjoyed the opportunity to ask writers this ever since a couple of years ago when Young was inducted. And he was talking about how when he was writing his poems, he essentially visualized the entire poem from the outset. And so the act of writing was really just getting it down. Is it that way for you? Do you know your poem before you write it?
No, I'm really quite fascinated. I would like that to happen. To a certain extent, maybe if I'm, 8 lines into something and I say that's a sonnet, then I can sort of see that there are 6 more spaces that have to be filled. I just sometimes have a kind of idea of a length or a shape, but if I do get that vision, it's usually 3/4 of the way through or 2/3 of the way through, and I suddenly see an out. I actually think that poets it's very easy to get into a poem, but it is very hard to get out. And the problem with most poems is a kind of panicked emergency dismount, and so I'm always very relieved when I see that there's an exit to the poem, and that's. But no, I'm quite fascinated by that. Maybe that will happen to me sometime.
I'll just shout with a question for the back. So I'm curious, since you said you shared traditions with A.E. Housman, did you choose to call yourself A.E. for that reason, or a particular reason?
Well, I think I did start publishing poems when I was very young. I submitted poems. I published a poem in 17 magazine when I was 16, and
That's cheating.
yes, maybe. And they sent me a check for $15, and I thought, wow, this is the way to make easy money. But I think early on, I was a big reader of fantasy and poetry. So basically all of the writers I knew were sort of T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien and W.H. Auden. And so I really thought that if anyone was going to take me seriously, I needed to have initials. I do think also I was submitting poems when I was very young, and I really, as the young do, I really, really wanted to be taken seriously and be thought of as older. I now have the total opposite. And I would send out these letters, and I get these responses back, dear Mr. Stallings. And I think it did not hurt that my gender was not clear in my submissions, and it was therefore assumed that I was male. I'm sorry to say that is the case, but I think it is the case. To this day, I get some very strange, because I published this translation of Lucretius some years back, and I will have people come up. I had someone come up to me at an event and say, "Oh, are you the daughter of A.E. Stallings?" in a sense.
Am I entitled to a second wife? Yeah. Talk about what living in Athens has meant in terms of your poetic writings.
Well, the question is about how living in Athens, Greece, has affected my writing and what it's like there. As I mentioned, it has been a time of almost kind of unprecedented upheaval and unrest. Not unprecedented. There's World War II and the Civil War and Balkan Wars, but you know, in modern contemporary times, Greece has been on the forefront of basically every crisis of the West and of Europe. And Athens is very visible in Athens. And you know, the economic crisis was very visible, the refugee crisis is very visible. I'm quite involved with refugees in various ways. You know, and then there's the Acropolis, and there's, you know, crumbling neoclassical buildings, and there's graffiti, and there are protest marches, and there's tear gas. There's beauty, and there, you know, all of this is happening all the time. It's exhausting. You know, and my husband is a journalist, so he's flying out to Lesbos or wherever things are happening. I think part of it, how it has affected me, is I do a lot more prose, although they tend to be kind of short, intense essays, sort of literary journalism that bring in poetry and classics and current events. So, you know, they're not prose poems, I guess they're lyric essays. So there is more of that. There's probably, in some ways, less of a certain kind of lyric poetry, which I hope I will get back to writing. I do put more current events. I have done some satiric things. I've done some Byronic things. Byron is a kind of interesting model for doing reportage in verse, while being directly involved in the events. So, yeah, it's been interesting.
How has living in Greece changed your view of the United States in the 21st century?
Well, to give you an idea, I moved to Greece in January of 1999 when Clinton was being impeached. And this was, you know, obviously before the Twin Towers and so forth. So I've been away a long time. And I mean, I do visit, but I mean, I do think the US is different. I think some things are the same, but some things are really quite different from when I left. Although, you know, the impeachment thing has come around again. So, I mean, it's been interesting for me to be an American abroad. I mean, you know, having to explain. People want you constantly to explain what is happening and so on. And it's like, I don't know what to say. Yeah, so it's part of it, you know, I've changed and the United States has changed, but many things are still the same. And I think one of the things that I forget when I'm living abroad and I'm reading horrible news stories or whatever is how really, I would say pretty much across the political spectrum in the States, in person, people are so warm and friendly and kind and thoughtful. And it's easy on Facebook and so forth when you're talking with people to forget that, you know, in person, people are not, you know, so hostile or aggressive to each other as they are on social media. And I really left before social media. I mean, there was email, but none of these other things existed. So, you know, I think that is different, but I don't know if I answered the question.
It hasn't arrived yet, but the battle between frogs and mice had just come. And I was wondering if you could tell us about how that came about and what it was like.
So actually my latest book, which I think is, I mean, it's only just come out, but it would be a wonderful Christmas present for any budding young classicists in your life. It is an illustrated edition of the pseudo-Homeric battle between the frogs and the mice, the Batrachomiomachia, which is a short poem in Homeric Greek dactylic hexameter, and it comes with an introduction by A. Nani Mouse, who's discovered certain scholarly things, and in ancient times, and actually into the early modern period, or maybe later, it was assumed that Homer had actually written the battle between the frogs and the mice, and in fact it is very good Homeric Greek. This was, he tossed it off as a lark, or maybe he did it to show he was disappointed with how people had taken the other poems. It is really, really graphic in terms of like how mice and frogs die. But if your kid, it's more itchy and scratchy than Tom and Jerry. But if your kids can watch Itchy and Scratchy, then they're ready for the frogs and the mice.
Just time for one more question.
I was wondering how you see the work of translating affecting the way you write. Over your time as a translator, has it affected your writing more and more, like with time, or do you see them as separate works?
They are certain, and thank you for your beautiful poem on Orpheus. I really enjoyed that. Translation and my poetry, they're very, very close together, and in fact, my first, I think, kind of grown-up publication of a poem, after 17 and cat fancy and all that, was a translation of Catullus that was done in Dr. Lafleur's class. This was published in the Classical Outlook, which is a journal of classical education and so forth. And they really have always been very intertwined for me. If you are a poet and you have access to any other language, translation is wonderful because translation is a bit like what you talked about, Ken Young writing a poem and already kind of knowing what it's going to say, but just how to say it. That's kind of what translation is. But it's a kind of very, very intense reading. For instance, if you're in a Latin or Greek class or Spanish class and you're going through a piece of literature, everyone can kind of agree on a fudging translationese for a line. But if you're trying to turn that into literature, you're going to have to come down on one side or the other on the controversy. If you really don't know what it means, you're going to have to decide what it means because it has to mean in English. It's really wonderful. I also, we are in a kind of golden age of female translators of classics. I would actually like to say that Lucretius was kind of at the very forefront of that. I think also we're in a golden age of translation where people are realizing that translation is not a secondary art. It is not something secondary, it is a primary art. It is just as creative as original poetry. Literary translators are themselves artists, and it's not just, they don't also have to be a poet in their own right. So I think we're in a very kind of exciting theoretical time about translation and an exciting practical time about translation. I love I think it's Kenneth Rex Roth's statement about it, that translation saves you from your contemporaries. And that's really important, and especially in an age of like creative writing, and people are all, there wasn't a creative writing program when I was here. That people don't realize when they're in creative writing programs that there is a kind of style. You may not think that there is a kind of current style, but almost everyone in your program is going to be writing in that style that you can't see because it's the atmosphere in which you live and breathe. But with translation you can explore being another gender, another race, another time, and you get to be free from your own voice. I think this whole pressure of originality and finding your, is it odd? And he says once you find your voice, then you have to figure out how to get rid of it. And translation really allows for so much creativity and exploration and learning how different kinds of poems work. I learned how longer poems worked by translating them, which is why I've been able to do longer and longer poems. And it frees you from that existential angst of, okay, if I write a sonnet and I think this is actually a really good poem, tomorrow I still have to face a blank page, and I might not ever write a poem again. This is every poet's terror all the time. But with translation, I can say, I'm going to do 20 lines, which would be a good day, by the way. I'm going to do 4 lines, and that kind of, you can do the work and you can practice all the muscles, and you don't have that angst all the time.
Thank you. There's a reception out there. Oh wait, I should. Need to make some announcements. Before I let you off to get your wine. Okay, but really a proper thanks for all of you for being here and being such a generous audience. So tomorrow, Sunday. Sunday, there's a Georgia Review meet and greet at 2:30 here before the 4 p.m. conversation with A. Stallings and John T. Edge. So if you have a little bit of time, swing by, get some coffee, get some treats, come say hi to us. The staff will be there, and we're eager to meet you guys. Holiday gift subscriptions are now available for a very special rate of $30 for 4 issues. It's regularly priced at $40, you can visit our website or see our sales table for more information. And today, new and renewing subscribers will get a free copy of our Georgia Writers Hall of Fame special issue with their purchase. Now we can go out and get beer, wine, company, buy the books, get them signed, and enjoy each other's company. Thank you.